You really think a waitress understands French? Ethan Whitmore didn't bother lowering his voice when he said it. The sentence drifted across the private dining room like a spark landing on dry grass. A few people laughed. Others smirked into crystal glasses filled with $1,000 wine. At the center of the room, beneath chandeliers that glowed like frozen gold, a $500 million deal was only minutes away from becoming official. Investors from New York, Paris, and San Francisco sat around a polished walnut table that stretched nearly 20 feet from end to end. Lawyers reviewed final pages. Assistants checked schedules. Cameras waited outside the doors for the announcement that would make headlines by morning. Everything about the evening had been designed to celebrate power. And power, Ethan believed, belonged to people like him. At 42, the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Capital carried success the way some men carried expensive watches. Effortlessly. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His silver cufflinks reflected the candlelight. His smile was polished enough to win interviews and sharp enough to end negotiations. People listened when Ethan spoke. They usually agreed. Across the room, Naomi Carter moved quietly between tables carrying a tray of sparkling water. 27 years old. Black. Professional. Invisible, at least in the eyes of most guests. She wore the same black uniform as every other server in the restaurant. Her name tag caught the light whenever she turned. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in a room discussing international acquisitions worth $500 million. And that was exactly why no one paid attention to her. Ethan glanced toward one of the French executives and switched languages again. The conversation flowed smoothly, fast enough that most people nearby couldn't follow. He said something that made several executives laugh. Then he tilted his head slightly toward Naomi. More laughter followed. She continued pouring water without reacting. Not a twitch. Not a glance. Not a single sign that she understood what had just been said. That confidence made Ethan bolder. It always did. The room buzzed with anticipation. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky. Streams of headlights crawled through the streets below. Helicopter lights blinked in the distance above the Hudson. Inside, every detail felt expensive. Every sound felt important. The soft clink of silverware. The murmur of investors. The turning of contract pages. It was the kind of room where fortunes changed hands before dessert arrived. Ethan leaned back comfortably in his chair. To him, the evening was already over. The signatures were a formality. The victory was secured. He raised his glass and exchanged another comment in French. This time the executive beside him laughed hard enough to nearly spill his drink. Naomi happened to be standing only a few feet away. Still, she said nothing. She simply adjusted a water glass and continued her work. What Ethan couldn't see was the brief flicker in her eyes. The smallest reaction. Gone almost instantly. Because Naomi Carter had spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight. Years learning that people often revealed their true character when they believed no one important was listening. Tonight was proving no different. Around the table, lawyers organized final documents into neat stacks. One contract sat near the center, thicker than the others, waiting for signatures that would move hundreds of millions of dollars across continents. Cameras would soon be invited inside. Hands would be shaken. Smiles would be photographed. But before any of that happened, something else would occur first. Something no one in the room expected. Because hidden beneath the confidence, the laughter, and the certainty of a billionaire who believed he controlled every outcome was a mistake. And hidden behind a waitress's quiet smile was someone who had already noticed it. Naomi continued moving through the dining room as if nothing had happened. The laughter behind her faded into the steady hum of expensive conversations, but the words remained clear in her mind. Not because they hurt, because they mattered. Every sentence Ethan and his associates had exchanged in French had revealed more than they realized. She stopped near his side. Station, collecting a fresh bottle of sparkling water while the final preparations for the signing accelerated around her. The atmosphere had shifted. The room no longer felt like a dinner. It felt like a countdown. Assistants moved faster. Attorneys compared notes. Phones vibrated with incoming messages from executives waiting for confirmation that the acquisition would be completed before the markets opened overseas. Across the room, Ethan stood beside a massive digital presentation screen reviewing key figures with a group of investors. His confidence filled every corner of the restaurant. People leaned toward him when he spoke. They nodded before he even finished sentences. To them, success had become proof that he was always right. Naomi had seen that kind of confidence before. Sometimes it came from experience. Sometimes it came from money. And sometimes it came from people spending so many years being agreed with that they forgot they could still be wrong. She approached another table and quietly refilled several glasses. As she worked, fragments of conversation drifted through the air. Revenue projections, market expansion, regulatory approvals, the language of billion-dollar business. Most of it sounded impressive. Some of it sounded rehearsed. Then she heard something again. Not from the investors. From the legal team. A senior attorney flipped through a thick stack of papers and mentioned a clause number. Another attorney responded immediately. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Naomi noticed something unusual. The page they referenced was not the same page she remembered hearing discussed in French earlier. A small detail. Easy to miss. The kind of detail most people ignored. Her eyes moved toward the contract resting near the center of the table. Hundreds of pages. Thousands of words. $500 million depending on every line being correct. She looked away quickly. It was not her place to study legal documents. Not according to anyone in that room. Yet something felt wrong. Nearby, Ethan accepted congratulations before the deal was even finalized. One investor joked that he should already be planning how to spend the profits. Another raised a glass and toasted the future. More laughter followed. Naomi noticed the French executive from earlier smile politely, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. It appeared for a moment and disappeared just as quickly. That caught her attention. Experienced people often revealed concerns in silence long before they spoke them aloud. The restaurant lights reflected against the windows, turning Manhattan into a field of scattered diamonds beyond the glass. The city looked calm from 30 stories above the streets. Inside, however, pressure continued building. A production crew arrived outside the private room. Cameras were being positioned. Reporters waited downstairs. Everyone expected a celebration. No one expected a problem. Naomi carried another tray toward the main table. As she passed behind several executives, she overheard French once more. This time the conversation was quieter, faster, more urgent. A phrase repeated twice. Then a reference to liability. Then a clause number. Her grip tightened slightly around the tray. There it was again. The same section. The same concern. Hidden beneath layers of confidence and champagne. She kept walking without changing expression. Years earlier, she had learned an important lesson. People often ignored the person carrying the drinks. They assumed service workers existed only at the edges of important moments. They never imagined someone might be listening. They never imagined someone might understand. Across the room, Ethan raised his glass again, preparing for the official signing ceremony. Applause began spreading through the room. Chairs shifted. Attorneys organized final copies. Pens were placed beside signature pages. Everything was ready. Everything except for the one detail that refused to leave Naomi's mind. And as the contract was placed directly in front of Ethan Whitmore, the feeling became impossible to ignore. Somewhere inside those pages was a mistake. A mistake nobody powerful enough to stop the signing had noticed yet. The applause continued rolling across the room, but Naomi barely heard it anymore. Her attention remained fixed on the contract resting near Ethan's hand. The voices around her faded into background noise, replaced by memories she had spent years trying to keep buried beneath long shifts and quiet routines. There had been a time when rooms like this were not foreign to her. A time when she sat at conference tables instead of serving them. A time when legal language, international negotiations, and multilingual contracts had been part of her daily life rather than distant reminders of what might have been. 6 years earlier, Naomi Carter had walked across a university stage with honors in international business law. Professors predicted she would join one of the country's most respected firms before her 30th birthday. Recruiters competed for interviews. Classmates asked for advice before major exams. She spoke English and French fluently and had spent a semester studying commercial law in Paris. Back then, her future seemed straightforward. Work hard, build a career, earn a seat at the table. Life, however, rarely follows the plans people make when they are 21. 3 months after graduation, Naomi's mother received a diagnosis that changed everything. Medical appointments became weekly, then daily. Insurance covered some expenses, but not enough. Savings disappeared. Bills multiplied. Dreams that once seemed close enough to touch slowly drifted farther away. Naomi turned down a prestigious internship because it required relocating to another state. She accepted temporary jobs closer to home. Temporary became permanent. 1 year became 2, then 3. Eventually, the resumes stopped going out. The interviews stopped being scheduled. The legal textbooks were packed into storage boxes. Reality replaced ambition one paycheck at a time. Through it all, Naomi never complained. She worked mornings, nights, weekends, holidays. She learned that dignity sometimes looked less like success and more like endurance. Friends moved into corner offices. She memorized restaurant menus. Former classmates negotiated mergers. She learned which customers preferred sparkling water over still. Yet despite everything she had sacrificed, she never stopped learning. During breaks, she read legal journals on her phone. At night she followed international business cases. She translated French articles simply to keep her skills sharp. Knowledge became the one thing life could not take away from her. The restaurant manager once joked that Naomi read more contracts than some attorneys. She laughed and never explained why. Most people assumed she was simply curious. Nobody asked deeper questions. Nobody expected a waitress to carry years of legal training behind a professional smile. Back in the present, the private dining room glowed beneath soft amber lighting. Investors continued celebrating. Attorneys prepared signature packets. Outside the glass walls, New York shimmered beneath the darkness like a city built entirely from ambition. Naomi glanced toward Ethan again. He looked completely at ease. Confident, relaxed, victorious. He was already imagining tomorrow's headlines. She wondered if he had ever experienced the feeling of watching years of work depend on a single overlooked detail. Then she noticed something else. One of the French executives was no longer smiling. His eyes remained fixed on the contract. His fingers tapped softly against the table. Once, twice, 3 times. Small signs. Easy to miss. The same signs Naomi remembered seeing from nervous law students before final exams and anxious clients before major settlements. Something was bothering him. The feeling inside her grew stronger. The clause numbers she had overheard. The references to liability. The repeated conversations in French. None of it fit together by accident. A server beside her whispered that the signing would begin in less than 5 minutes. Naomi nodded politely. 5 minutes. 300 seconds. That was all that remained before signatures transformed concern into commitment. She looked one final time toward the stack of documents. Somewhere within those pages was the answer. And for the first time all evening, Naomi realized the question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was whether she should say anything before it was too late. Naomi stood motionless beside the service station while the final minutes slipped away. The temptation to stay silent was powerful. After all, nobody had asked for her opinion. Nobody had invited her into the conversation. Nobody in that room expected insight from the woman carrying water glasses. Yet the closer the signing ceremony came, the louder the warning in her mind became. Across the room, a senior attorney opened the final version of the agreement and carefully arranged signature tabs along the bottom corners of several pages. Another attorney reviewed a checklist on a tablet. The process looked flawless. It looked professional. It looked inevitable. Ethan stepped forward and thanked everyone for attending. His voice carried easily through the private dining room. Investors smiled. Executives applauded. Several people lifted their phones to capture the moment. This was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter for Whitmore Capital. $500 million. International expansion. Industry headlines. The kind of deal business schools would discuss for years. As Ethan spoke, Naomi noticed the French executive again. His name was Laurent Delacroix. Throughout the evening, he had remained composed, but now a shadow of concern lingered behind his expression. He nodded at the appropriate moments. He smiled when expected. Yet his eyes kept returning to the contract. Not to the signature pages. To the middle section. The same area referenced in the conversations Naomi had overheard. She felt her pulse quicken. Something was wrong, and Laurent knew it. The problem was that he seemed uncertain whether anyone else had noticed. The room grew quieter as Ethan concluded his remarks. The legal teams approached the table. Pens were distributed. Chairs shifted. Camera crews outside the glass doors prepared to enter. The deal was seconds away from becoming official. Then Naomi heard one final exchange in French. Quiet. Barely above a whisper. Laurent leaned toward another executive and spoke only a single sentence. But that sentence changed everything. Naomi understood every word. The executive replied immediately. Both men glanced toward the contract. Neither looked comfortable. Neither looked confident. They looked trapped. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. In law, timing mattered. In business, timing mattered even more. A correct observation delivered too late could become completely useless. She thought about the years she had spent studying complex agreements. She remembered professors repeating the same lesson over and over. Read every clause. Then read it again. Because one contradiction hidden inside a contract could create consequences no spreadsheet could predict. The applause began again as Ethan accepted a pen from his lead attorney. Bright smiles filled the room. Several investors stood to secure better views for photographs. The atmosphere felt almost celebratory. Yet beneath the excitement, Naomi saw something nobody else seemed to notice. Laurent's hand remained frozen on the edge of the table. Not moving. Not reaching for a pen. Waiting. As if he hoped someone would stop the process before it reached the point of no return. Ethan uncapped the pen. The lead attorney slid the signature page into position. Every eye in the room shifted toward the document. The city lights beyond the windows shimmered against the darkness. The chandeliers reflected across polished glass. Hundreds of millions of dollars balanced on a few inches of paper. Naomi took a slow breath. One more minute of silence, and the opportunity would disappear forever. She looked at the contract, then at Ethan, then at Laurent. The room felt smaller now, tighter. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation. Ethan lowered the pen toward the page. And for the first time all evening, Naomi stepped away from the service station and began walking toward the table. The distance between Naomi and the table was less than 20 feet, yet it felt longer than every year she had spent rebuilding her life. Conversations continued around her. Glasses clinked. Investors smiled. Nobody noticed her approach at first. Why would they? She was a waitress. People saw the uniform before they saw the person wearing it. Ethan positioned the pen above the signature line. His lead attorney nodded confidently. The cameras outside the room began moving closer to the doors. In a matter of seconds, the deal would become official. Then Naomi stopped beside the table. Her voice was calm, respectful, almost quiet. "Excuse me." The single phrase cut through the room far more effectively than shouting ever could. Ethan looked up, surprised. Several attorneys turned toward her. A few guests exchanged puzzled glances. Naomi maintained perfect composure. "I believe there may be an issue in the contract." Silence followed. Not complete silence. Just enough for people to wonder whether they had heard correctly. Ethan blinked once. Then a faint smile appeared. The kind adults sometimes give children who have wandered into conversations they do not understand. "An issue?" he asked. Several people chuckled softly. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." The lead attorney adjusted his glasses. "Which section are you referring to?" Naomi looked toward the document. Clause 14.7. The room grew noticeably still. That was not a random answer. That was a specific answer. The attorney glanced down at the contract. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Amusement replaced surprise. "This should be interesting," he said. A few executives laughed again. One of them whispered something under his breath. Naomi ignored all of it. Her focus remained on the document. Clause 14.7 appears to conflict with Clause 9.2 regarding liability allocation and post-acquisition obligations. This time nobody laughed immediately. The attorney's expression changed. Just slightly. Enough to be noticed. Ethan noticed it too. "And how exactly would you know that?" he asked. His tone remained polite, but skepticism filled every word. Naomi met his gaze. "Because the two clauses assign responsibility differently under the same circumstances." The attorney opened the contract. Another lawyer stepped closer. Pages turned. Pens stopped moving. Around the room, conversations died away one by one. Ethan folded his arms. "You are telling me that a team of attorneys from two countries missed something that a waitress discovered while serving water?" More laughter followed, but it sounded less certain now. Naomi answered without hesitation. "No, sir. I am saying the language creates contradictory obligations. If interpreted literally, both parties could claim the other is responsible for the same liability." The attorney reached Clause 14. His eyes scanned the text. Then he flipped backward, then forward again. The movement caught everyone's attention. Laurent Delacroix suddenly sat straighter in his chair. For the first time all evening, genuine interest appeared on his face. Ethan noticed that as well. The room no longer felt celebratory. It felt cautious, curious. The attorney continued reading. Another attorney joined him. Neither spoke. Naomi could almost hear the weight of every second passing. Investors looked between the lawyers and the waitress. Nobody seemed quite sure what was happening. Ethan maintained his confident smile, but it had become smaller now. More controlled. Less comfortable. Finally, the lead attorney looked up. What makes you believe Clause 9 creates a contradiction? Naomi took a slow breath. She knew this was the moment that mattered. Not because she needed to prove herself. Because the contract needed to be understood before it was signed. She glanced toward the French delegation. Then she answered in flawless French. Every syllable precise. Every word confident. The reaction was immediate. Lauren's eyes widened. Several executives froze. One investor nearly dropped his glass. Ethan stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. And suddenly the room that had spent the entire evening laughing at a waitress became a room desperately listening to every word she said. For several seconds, nobody moved. The elegant dining room that had been filled with confidence, conversation, and celebration seemed to freeze beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Naomi's French sounded effortless, natural, precise, not the memorized phrases of a tourist or the hesitant vocabulary of someone practicing a second language. This was the language of someone who understood every nuance, every technical term, every hidden implication buried inside a complex legal agreement. Laurent Delacroix slowly lowered the pen he had been holding. His expression shifted from surprise to disbelief. Then something even more important appeared. Relief. Across the table, the attorneys exchanged quick glances. One of them turned back to the contract. Another opened a digital copy on a tablet. The room had stopped looking at a waitress. The room was now looking at a potential answer. Ethan Whitmore remained silent. Earlier, silence had belonged to Naomi. Now it belonged to him. He watched as she continued explaining the conflict between the clauses. Her French flowed smoothly, then transitioned back into English without hesitation. She pointed to the specific language assigning post-acquisition liability. Then she referenced the later section that appeared to reverse that responsibility under a separate interpretation. Several investors leaned closer. The legal terminology was dense, but the implication was simple. If a dispute occurred after the acquisition closed, both companies could argue that the other party was responsible. A disagreement worth millions could emerge from a contradiction hidden in plain sight. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses again and reread both sections. This time he read them slowly. Very slowly. The confidence he had displayed earlier began fading. One page became 2, then 3. He highlighted portions of the text and passed the contract to another attorney. The second attorney read for nearly a minute before looking up. Nobody liked the expression on his face. She may have a point, he said quietly. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Investors stopped whispering. Executives stopped checking their phones. The atmosphere transformed completely. Celebration had become examination. Ethan finally leaned forward. May have, he asked. The attorney nodded carefully. The language creates ambiguity. Another lawyer joined the discussion. Then another. Soon 3 legal professionals were comparing notes directly in front of the room. None of them were smiling anymore. Naomi remained standing beside the table. Calm. Patient. She did not interrupt. She did not gloat. She simply waited. Years of experience had taught her that truth rarely needed help once people were willing to examine it honestly. Laurent spoke for the first time in several minutes. He addressed the attorneys in French. Naomi understood every word. The concern he had carried all evening finally became visible. He explained that his team had noticed the inconsistency during a final review, but had not reached a conclusion before the ceremony began. They intended to raise the issue after the signing discussion. The admission sent another wave of surprise through the room. Naomi had not imagined the problem. The concern had been real all along. Ethan looked from Laurent to the lawyers and then back to Naomi. His expression no longer carried amusement. It carried calculation. He was reassessing everything. The assumptions, the jokes, the comments spoken earlier in French. Most of all, he was reassessing the woman standing a few feet away. The lead attorney finally closed the contract and released a slow breath. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence. The contradiction is real, he said. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. $500 million sat on the table, and the person who had protected the deal was not an executive, an investor, or a senior partner at a prestigious law firm. It was Naomi Carter, the waitress everyone had overlooked until the moment they needed her most. The silence that followed felt different from every other silence that night. Earlier, people had been silent because they were confident. Now they were silent because they were stunned. The lead attorney's confirmation lingered in the air like an echo nobody could ignore. The contradiction was real. The risk was real. And the person who had uncovered it was standing beside the table wearing a server's uniform. Ethan looked down at the contract again, then back at Naomi. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain. Not afraid. Not angry. Simply forced to confront a reality he had never considered. Around the room, investors exchanged confused glances. A few minutes earlier, they had been preparing for photographs. Now they were watching attorneys revise language that could have exposed both companies to years of costly disputes. Laurent slowly rose from his chair. He approached the table and addressed Naomi directly in French. His voice carried genuine respect. He asked where she had learned to understand legal terminology at such a high level. Several executives immediately focused on her answer. Naomi hesitated for only a moment. She had spent years avoiding conversations about her past. Not because she was ashamed of it, because explaining it usually required explaining everything she had lost along the way. Yet tonight the truth seemed unavoidable. I studied international business law, she replied. The room remained still. Laurent blinked. One attorney lowered his pen. Another executive quietly repeated the words to himself, as if verifying he had heard correctly. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. You studied law, he asked. Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. The response sounded simple. The reality behind it was anything but. Questions followed immediately. Which university? What area of specialization? How did she become fluent in French? Each answer deepened the surprise. Honors graduate. International contract law. Study abroad program in Paris. Years spent analyzing cross-border agreements. The pieces began falling into place. Suddenly her confidence made sense. Her observations made sense. Even her silence throughout the evening made sense. She had not spoken because she lacked knowledge. She had remained quiet because nobody had given her a reason to speak. Laurent shook his head slowly, still amazed. You understood every conversation tonight, he asked in French. Naomi answered in the same language. Every word. A few executives visibly shifted in their seats. The realization spread quickly through the room. Every joke, every assumption, every dismissive comment spoken under the protection of a foreign language had been heard and understood. Nobody needed to explain what that meant. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly. The memory clearly reached him too. Earlier that evening, he had believed language gave him privacy. Now he understood it had only revealed his character. Yet Naomi showed no sign of resentment. She did not repeat what had been said. She did not embarrass anyone. She simply answered questions with calm professionalism. That restraint impressed the room almost as much as her expertise. The lead attorney finally closed the revised draft and looked toward Ethan. If she had not spoken up, we would have signed it exactly as written. Nobody challenged the statement. Nobody could. The evidence sat directly in front of them. $500 million had come within minutes of being attached to a flawed agreement. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. Every eye followed him. The billionaire who had commanded the room all evening now seemed more thoughtful than triumphant. He looked at Naomi for several seconds before speaking. And when he finally opened his mouth, the confidence was still there, but something else had joined it. Respect. Ethan's words came slowly, as though he had chosen to weigh each one before allowing it into the room. I owe you an apology. Nobody expected the billionaire to say it. Not the investors. Not the attorneys. Not even Naomi. The statement settled over the table with a different kind of power than the confidence he had displayed earlier. This was not the authority of wealth. It was the humility that appears when someone finally recognizes a truth they can no longer ignore. Ethan looked directly at Naomi. I made assumptions about you tonight. The room remained silent. No phones. No side conversations. No nervous laughter. Every person present understood that something more important than a business deal was unfolding. I assumed I knew who you were because of where you worked, Ethan continued. I assumed I understood what you were capable of. I was wrong. Naomi listened without changing expression. She had heard apologies before. Some sincere. Some offered merely because circumstances demanded them. What made this moment different was that nobody had forced Ethan to speak. He could have ignored the embarrassment. He could have focused only on the corrected contract. Instead, he chose accountability. Laurent nodded quietly from across the table. Several investors exchanged thoughtful looks. The attorneys seemed equally affected. Earlier, they had viewed Naomi as an interruption. Now they were looking at her with professional respect. Ethan glanced toward the revised contract. You protected everyone in this room tonight, he said, including me. The admission carried weight because everyone knew it was true. The legal teams had already confirmed the corrected language. The contradiction had been removed. The agreement was now stronger than before. A problem that could have lingered for years had been solved before a single signature touched paper. One investor finally spoke. Why did you never go back? The question was directed at Naomi. It was not asked with skepticism. It was asked with genuine curiosity. Naomi looked down briefly before answering. Life changed. She explained only enough for people to understand. Her mother's illness. The opportunities she had declined. The responsibilities that arrived without warning. The years spent choosing family over ambition. She did not tell the story dramatically. She simply told the truth. Somehow that made it even more powerful. Around the room, faces softened. Success often receives admiration. Sacrifice earns something deeper. Ethan listened carefully. For perhaps the first time that evening, he was not thinking like a chief executive. He was thinking like a human being. The city lights continued glowing beyond the windows. Far below, millions of people moved through New York without knowing that a waitress had just become the most respected person in a room full of powerful executives. The revised contract was placed back on the table. This time nobody rushed. Nobody treated the process as routine. Every page received careful attention. Every clause received another review. The room had learned an expensive lesson before paying an expensive price. When the final version was ready, Ethan turned toward Naomi once more. I would like to make an offer, he said. Several people smiled, already anticipating what came next. Ethan explained that Whitmore Capital maintained a legal and acquisitions division that regularly handled international transactions. He spoke carefully, making it clear that the offer was not charity, gratitude, or publicity. It was opportunity. Talent should not stay hidden, he said. Naomi looked at him for several seconds. The room waited. Investors leaned forward. Attorneys watched closely. Even Laurent seemed eager to hear her answer. Yet before she responded, something unexpected happened. Naomi smiled. Not because of the offer itself. Not because the room finally recognized her value. She smiled because after years of feeling invisible, the conversation had finally become about ability instead of assumptions. For a moment, nobody spoke. The offer hung in the air between possibility and disbelief. Naomi looked around the room. Earlier that evening, many of the same people had barely noticed her presence. Now they were waiting for her answer. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Yet Naomi did not rush. She had spent years learning that the most important decisions deserved more than emotional reactions. Ethan remained standing beside the table. There was no pressure in his expression. No expectation. Only sincerity. That alone made the moment remarkable. Wealth could purchase influence. It could purchase attention. But respect had to be earned. Tonight, respect had changed direction. Naomi finally spoke. Thank you. Her voice was calm and steady. That means more than you probably realize. Several people smiled. Ethan nodded. Does that mean you will consider it? Naomi glanced toward the city beyond the windows. New York stretched into the distance beneath the night sky, filled with millions of stories unfolding at the same time. For years, she had watched opportunities pass by while taking care of responsibilities that mattered more. She had never regretted those choices. Difficult did not mean wrong. Yes, she answered. I will consider it. The response earned a ripple of approval throughout the room. It was not dramatic. It was not triumphant. It felt real. The revised contract was placed back before the parties involved. This time, every page was reviewed carefully. Questions were asked. Clarifications were made. No one rushed. The lesson had already been learned. Eventually, the signatures were completed. Hands were shaken. Photographs were taken. The agreement was finalized with confidence instead of assumption. Yet despite the size of the deal, many people would remember something else from that night. They would remember the waitress who saw what everyone else missed. As guests began leaving the private dining room, several executives approached Naomi personally. Some thanked her. Others apologized for overlooking her. A few simply wanted to shake her hand. Laurent was among the last to leave. Before departing, he spoke to her in French one final time. He told her that intelligence revealed itself in many forms, but character revealed itself in moments like this. Naomi thanked him and wished him safe travels. Eventually, the room grew quiet. The investors were gone. The attorneys had packed their briefcases. The cameras had disappeared. Only a handful of staff members remained, clearing glasses and resetting tables for the next day. Ethan approached once more before leaving. "You know," he said, looking around the nearly empty room. "I walked in here tonight convinced I was the smartest person at the table." Naomi smiled softly. Ethan laughed at himself. "Turns out I was wrong about more than one thing." He extended his hand. Naomi shook it. Not as a waitress greeting a customer. Not as a billionaire greeting an employee. Just two people acknowledging a truth neither would forget. A few minutes later, Ethan walked away toward the elevators. The doors closed behind him. The night was over. Naomi stood quietly beside the windows for a moment before returning to work. There were still glasses to collect. Still tables to clean. Life rarely transformed in a single instant, even after extraordinary nights. Yet something had changed. Not because a billionaire had made an offer. Not because executives had applauded. Not because a $500 million contract had been saved. Something had changed because the room had finally learned what it should have known from the beginning. A person's value is not determined by a title, a uniform, or a seat at the table. Intelligence does not ask permission to exist. Dignity does not require recognition to be real. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the very person holding the wisdom that saves the day. Ethan arrived with the power to sign the contract. Naomi arrived with the knowledge to protect it. And in the end, that made all the difference.